but is a hammer throw coach called Anatoly Bondarchuk. And his structure of periodization to me is very interesting because he takes almost the opposite approach. What he does is he designs a program, and it might be have 1, 2, 3 different sessions that he does across a cycle, and he'll repeat those sessions over and over and over. He doesn't change anything about what he does in those sessions. They're exactly the same. But what he's looking at is the response of that person. So he looks for the outcome, right, to determine how long it takes someone to reach a level of improvement in that task. And he also won't vary those things until he sees, say, an improvement and then a plateau. If we contrast that with what most people will do is we don't necessarily measure those performance outcomes. What we do is we make an assumption about how much stress that's going to be. And then what we do is we adjust based on, maybe measures of fatigue or an assumed measure of fatigue rather than waiting for the outcome to actually give us a response. And one of the interesting parts of Bondarchuk's discussion, and if anyone's interested, he's got a number of books called, I think they're based on the sort of, transfer of training is some of the titles. I haven't read them specifically. I've done some work. For those who are interested, Derek Everly has done a number of courses and translations for people. He's Canadian coach as well, because his books are actually, because they're a translation from Russian, they don't translate very well. So supposedly if you read his books, they don't tend to make a lot of sense. So I haven't actually read specifically books, but I've done actually 2 courses that Derek Everly's put out on the Bondarchuk sort of methodology. And with my limited understanding of it, so I'll put that caveat there, but my limited understanding of it is he typically discusses 3 different responses you get, and in our discussion on stress and hormesis, we spoke about the more traditional response that we see that Hans Selye put forward, being, that general adaptation syndrome.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's probably worth just highlighting before you go into more detail, because one of the limitations to a lot of the periodization models that are put out there is that every person is going to have that general adaptation syndrome response.
Yes.
So this is what we talked about last week when we think about the hormetic response.
People will see it's like a sinusoidal type shape.
So you get that initial negative response
and performance goes down.
Correct. Accumulation of fatigue. And then with an appropriate amount of recovery, then you'll get that supercompensatory. And you'll often see that in, say, periodization structures, where if you've got like a 4-week training block, you get an increase in volume or intensity over 3 weeks. You have that down week. The expectation is you've reached that supercompensatory effect. So for the next training block, you can start at a higher level.
Yeah.
But as you're highlighting
here, I think one of the interesting concepts with that is that's based on our prediction of how we think those people or that individual is going to respond. It's not necessarily how they will respond. It's just how we think they will respond based on the theoretical structure of plans.
Which, when you think about it, actually makes a lot of sense, because let's say, for instance, like putting, say, genes aside, but let's say, for instance, say big confounding factors for response is, say, diet. If all of a sudden that you're depriving the body of amino acids, you're going to have a big change in terms of how you respond to that training load, let alone the multitude of factors that will also influence it.
But interestingly, if you actually look at some of the discussion that Bondarchuk put forward, he discusses that you actually get 3 different responses typically that he's seen with the athletes that he's worked in. And because he's not changing the training, I think you start getting a much clearer indication of what the outcome is. Now, he's lucky because he typically was working with throwing athletes, where there's not, although it's not completely closed, they're outdoors and there's weather and all that kind of things, it's pretty closed.
Yes.
It's the execution of a skill in an environment that's pretty controlled.
Yes.
So it's not like playing basketball or soccer where you've got lots of variability.
It's very unconstrained, yeah. There's a lot of things that you have to do in terms of reacting.
But what he found was typically the response is not always that the person's performance goes down and then you give him rest and he comes back up. Sometimes what he would find is some people's performance would go down slightly, but then it would go right up and improve significantly and then plateau. Some people's would do nothing for a while then start going up.
Mm.
Some people's would do nothing, then go down, then go up.